Jack Churchill, UK Mad Jack, fought with sword and longbow. In 1940, the world was fighting with Tiger tanks, Messerschmitts, and machine guns. But in the middle of the most advanced war in history, one man decided the 20th century was too boring. He stormed the beaches of Normandy, not with a rifle, but with a Scottish broadsword. He took down German sentries, not with a silencer, but with a 6-foot longbow. His name was Jack Churchill, but the world would remember him as Mad Jack. His commanders thought he was insane. The Germans thought he was a ghost from the Middle Ages. But behind the madness was a man who survived 2 concentration camps, walked across Europe on foot, and uttered the most badass line in military history. Today, we look at the man who brought a sword to a gunfight and actually won. The anchor in a storm of lead. Imagine the scene. It's the dawn of modern warfare. Tanks are churning through the mud. Screaming Stuka dive bombers are tearing the sky in half. And the air is thick with the scent of cordite and impending doom. The British Expeditionary Force is pinned down. A German patrol creeps forward, confident in the clinical superiority of the MP-40 submachine gun. They're expecting a hail of bullets. Instead, they get a whistle. A cloth-yard arrow, tipped with cold steel, rips through the air and pins a German sergeant to the scenery. While every other soldier in the 20th century was clinging to the Industrial Revolution, one man decided to bring the 14th century to a gunfight.
Meet Captain John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, but you can just call him Mad Jack, because in a world gone clinically insane, Jack Churchill was the only man who made any sense. The 1930s were, for most, a time of tension. For Jack, they were a total drag. Jack wasn't built for the pip-pip-cheerio civility of peacetime Britain. He was a man born 500 years too late and with about 500 times too much testosterone for a desk job. He was, quite literally, dangerously bored. And when Jack got bored, things got weird. He spent his off time curating a resume that looked like a fever dream. He was a professional male model, appearing in ads for everything from suits to cigarettes. He was a world-class archer, representing Great Britain at the World Championships in Oslo. And then there were the bagpipes. Most people learn an instrument to impress girls or pass the time. Jack learned the pipes so well he took second place in the 1938 Aldershot Piping Championship. Mind you, he was the only Englishman in the competition. He didn't just play the pipes, he weaponized the noise. He once took a job as an extra in films like The Thief of Baghdad because it gave him an excuse to shoot arrows at people for money. But the glitz of cinema wasn't enough. The grease paint was thin, the stakes were low. Jack was waiting for the real stage to be set. When Hitler's war machine finally ground into Poland, the world trembled. Governments panicked. Generals sweated. Jack Churchill? Jack Churchill smiled. While his fellow officers were agonizing over logistics and gas masks, Jack was in his quarters, conducting a very different kind of inventory.
Officer, stammering Churchill, is that a bloody sword? Jack, without looking up, eyes gleaming. In my opinion, sir, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. The faces of his superiors were a mix of sheer confusion and genuine concern for his mental health. But Jack wasn't crazy. He was focused. While others brought extra ammo, Jack brought a medieval armory. He wasn't just preparing for a tactical engagement, he was preparing for a saga. To Jack, the impending conflict wasn't a modern war of attrition, it was an epic poem waiting to be written in blood and arrows. He didn't want to just defeat the enemy, he wanted to haunt their nightmares with the sound of a Highland dirge. As the ships began to pull away from the English coast, the reality of the situation began to sink in for the young lads of the BEF. This wasn't a drill. They were headed into the teeth of the blitzkrieg.
Amidst the sea of khaki and the clatter of Lee-Enfield rifles, one sound cut through the salt air like a razor blade. There, on the prow of the transport ship, stood Jack, sword at his hip, longbow over his shoulder, playing the March of the Cameron Men as if he were leading a charge at Culloden. The men around him didn't know whether to cheer or call for a medic, but Jack knew. He knew that the 20th century was about to meet a man who refused to play by its rules. The Germans had the Luftwaffe, they had the Panzers, they had the Enigma machine, but they didn't have Mad Jack, and they were about to find out exactly why that was a problem. The Arrow and the Blitzkrieg. The world was burning. France was collapsing faster than a cheap suit. The British Expeditionary Force, proud and disciplined just weeks before, was now a ragged, desperate tide ebbing towards the impossible salvation of Dunkirk. Panic was a tangible thing, a cold hand gripping every man's throat. Every man, that is, except one. While others re-zeroed their rifles and prayed for air cover, Captain Jack Churchill was ensuring his medieval kit was up to snuff. He'd famously declared, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." And Jack, by God, was always properly dressed. He was an anchor in a storm of lead, a man who saw the chaos not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to finally get some decent exercise. The Germans were moving fast, too fast. Their reconnaissance patrols, sleek and efficient, were scouting ahead of the main advance, slicing through the French countryside like hot knives through butter. It was a fluid, terrifying new kind of war, and Jack Churchill had a medieval solution. He wasn't waiting for a firefight. He wasn't waiting for reinforcements. He was waiting to hunt, and he had chosen his perch well. A literal hayloft, giving him a perfect vantage point over the empty village square. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic beat of his own heart and the distant, hungry growl of the German advance. Then they came. A small German patrol, confident, precise. 3 men, rifles at the ready, sweeping through the square. Their sergeant, a burly, confident man, paused to check a map. It was all the invitation Jack needed. There was no crack of a rifle, no spray of bullets, just the whisper of the arrow, a sound as ancient as war itself. It flew true, a steel-tipped messenger from an age long past, and struck the German sergeant squarely in the chest. The only recorded longbow kill of the entire Second World War, a single arrow in the heart of modern warfare. It wasn't just a kill, it was a psychological broadside. These men were trained for bullets, for grenades, for the brutal efficiency of the Blitzkrieg. They were not prepared for Agincourt in the middle of 1940. While they scrambled, Jack's section, hidden in the surrounding buildings, opened fire with their rifles. The Germans, disoriented and terrified by the bizarre, silent death of their leader, were quickly overwhelmed.
The skirmish at Lepinette was a small victory, a tiny act of defiance in a tidal wave of defeat. But the retreat continued. Dunkirk was still a desperate gamble, and the Germans were closing in. Jack, ever the showman, decided the morale needed a boost. He marched alongside his men, bagpipes blaring, a one-man defiant concert against the encroaching enemy. It was absurd. It was magnificent. It was pure Jack. During one particularly brutal engagement, a machine gun round tore into his shoulder. Most men would have collapsed. Most men would have cried for a stretcher. Jack simply pulled out a field dressing, wrapped it himself, and kept fighting. He even allegedly carried a wounded comrade to safety, all while still lugging his beloved pipes. Because you never, ever leave a man behind, and you certainly never leave your bagpipes. Finally,
After weeks of fighting, retreating, and playing his bizarre, personal brand of psychological warfare, Jack and his men made it to the beaches of Dunkirk. The miracle of Dunkirk, indeed. Over 300,000 men snatched from the jaws of annihilation. As his ship sailed away from the burning coast of France back towards the safety of England, you might expect a sigh of relief, a moment of quiet reflection. But Jack Churchill wasn't like other men. When asked about his experience in the chaotic retreat, his response was pure, unadulterated Jack. He had faced the German war machine with a bow and arrow, been shot, saved lives, and played his bagpipes through the gates of hell. And his biggest regret? Not getting to swing a bloody great sword. This was not a man who understood defeat. This was a man who understood how to be properly dressed. And the war for Jack was just getting started.
The Highland Thunder on WWII. Christmas was over, but for the men of No. 3 Commando, the real party was just starting. WWII, Norway. Operation Archery. The goal, total annihilation of the German coastal batteries and fish oil factories fueling the Nazi war machine. But as the landing craft hit the surf, the men inside weren't thinking about fish oil. They were thinking about the noise. In the bow of the lead craft, one man wasn't ducking. He wasn't praying. He was inflating a bag. It was Jack. The Germans on the shore must have thought the Arctic air had finally snapped their minds. Through the mist, through the smoke of the Royal Navy's opening bombardment, they heard the ancestral war cry of the Highlands. Jack wasn't just playing music, he was casting a spell. He was summoning the ghost of every warrior who ever bled for a hill, and he was bringing them straight to Hitler's front door. The ramp hit the water, and the world went from tense to total carnage in a heartbeat. Jack didn't wade, he didn't stumble, he leaped. He charged the shore like a man possessed. He wasn't a soldier of 1941 anymore. He was a force of nature. He was a Viking returning home with a grudge. The psychological terror was absolute. Imagine you are a German conscript. You've been told this is a war of technology, of superior engineering, of the new order. Then, out of a cloud of cordite, a 6-foot-tall Brit with a terrifying grin lunges at you with a sword that looks like it belongs in a museum. Jack was everywhere, clearing bunkers, directing fire, leading charges. He was a whirlwind of steel and grit. In the heat of the assault, a stray German bullet ripped through the leather bag of his pipes. The music died. The Highland drone was silenced. Jack wasn't rattled by the near miss. He was annoyed. They'd broken his favourite instrument. He tucked the ruined pipes under one arm, gripped his sword tighter with the other, and went back to work with a renewed sense of personal vendetta.
Operation Archery was a textbook success. The factories were scrap metal. The batteries were silent. Hitler was so rattled by the raid, he moved 30,000 troops to Norway just to make sure it didn't happen again. Troops that could have been in Russia or France. He boarded the ship with the swagger of a conqueror. He had survived the freezing spray, the machine gun nests, and the loss of his pipes. He had proven that one man with a sword and a hell of a lot of madness could break the spirit of the Third Reich. Back in London, the story of WWII began to spread. It passed from trench to trench, from barracks to barracks. The British Army had a new icon, a man who didn't care about the rules of engagement, a man who fought as if the last 500 years of military history were just a suggestion. To some, he was the bravest officer in the king's service. To others, he was a liability who should have been in a padded cell. But everyone agreed on one thing. As long as Jack Churchill was breathing, the war was going to be anything but boring. Norway was just a warm-up, but Jack's luck was about to run out on a lonely hill in Yugoslavia, where he would face his greatest challenge yet, a battle he couldn't win with a sword.
The last dirge on Hill 622. War has a way of eventually catching up to even the luckiest men. For years, Jack Churchill had treated the Second World War like a personal playground, a stage for his bows, his blades, and his bagpipes. He had outrun the Blitzkrieg and outfought the Arctic winter. But on the island of Broch, at a god-forsaken piece of rock labeled Hill 622, the music was about to stop. The objective was simple: take the height, control the island. But the Germans had turned Hill 622 into a vertical fortress. They weren't just defending, they were erasing everything that moved on that slope. It wasn't a battle, it was a meat grinder. One by one, the men Jack had trained, the men who had followed his sword into the surf of Norway, were being cut down. The air was a thick soup of cordite, screams, and the rhythmic, mechanical thud, thud, thud of German MG-42s. By the time the summit was within reach, the army behind Jack Churchill had vanished into the rocks. He had reached the top, he had won the hill, but his prize was a front-row seat to his own execution. He was out of ammo, out of grenades, and surrounded by a German battalion that was closing the circle with clinical precision. Most men would have raised their hands. Most men would have sought the dignity of a quiet surrender. Jack Churchill? He looked at the German silhouettes advancing through the smoke, and he decided to give them a show. The world went white. The pipes fell silent. They should have killed him. On any other day, in any other unit, a commando of his caliber would have been executed under Hitler's commando order. But as they went through his tunic, they found his name: Churchill.
The Nazi High Command suffered from a chronic case of paranoia. They saw the name Churchill and their logic short-circuited. They didn't think he was just a soldier. They thought they had captured the Prime Minister's nephew, or perhaps a secret son. In reality, Jack and Winston weren't related at all. They shared a name and a love for a good fight, but that was it. Yet this case of mistaken identity became Jack's get-out-of-jail-free card. He was too valuable to shoot. He was a bargaining chip. He had survived the hill, but he had traded the open sky for a cage. Jack woke up in the dark. The smell of burning diesel and salt air was gone, replaced by the stagnant, hopeless stench of human misery. He wasn't in a POW camp. He wasn't being treated as an officer. He was in Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp, the heart of the Nazi nightmare. The man who lived for the wind in his face and the skirl of the pipes was now buried in the bowels of the Third Reich. For most men, this was the end of the story, a slow fade into the gray fog of the Holocaust. But the Nazis had made a critical mistake. They had left Jack Churchill alive, and they were about to find out that no wall on earth was built thick enough to hold a man who considered a world war to be a personal challenge.
The Great Escape and the Great Disappointment. Sachsenhausen wasn't a prison. It was a machine designed to break the human spirit. It was a place where hope went to die, surrounded by electrified wire, machine gun towers, and the relentless, crushing boredom of captivity. For the thousands trapped behind these walls, it was the end of the line. For Jack Churchill, it was a temporary inconvenience, a slightly too long layover in a trip that was far from over. September 1944. While the Allied armies were punching through the Siegfried Line, Jack was punching his own ticket out. He didn't wait for a rescue. He and an accomplice slipped into an old forgotten drainage pipe, covered themselves in filth to mask their scent, and literally crawled their way to freedom. They didn't just walk out. They embarked on a 200-kilometer trek toward the Baltic coast. Jack didn't have a compass. He didn't have a map.
He had a sense of direction that would put a migratory bird to shame, and a level of confidence that was borderline delusional. He treated the heart of the Third Reich like a weekend hike in the Highlands. He slept in haystacks, dodged patrols by whispering into the shadows, and scavenged what he could from the soil of the enemy. He was caught just miles from the sea. Most men would have been executed on the spot, but that Churchill name was still working its magic. Instead of a firing squad, Jack was sent to the Tyrol, a high-security fortress tucked away in the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Alps. The Nazis thought the mountains would be his bars. They were wrong. The mountains were his home turf. April 1945. The Reich is screaming its last breath. The power grid fails, plunging the mountain prison into a deep velvet blackness. Jack didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a plan. He simply stood up and walked into the shadows. By the time the Germans realized the madman was gone, Jack was already miles away, swallowed by the vertical wilderness of the Alps. This is where the story shifts from war movie to survival horror. Jack set a course for Italy, 150 miles to the south. He had no coat, no boots meant for mountaineering. His only supplies? A tin of onions he'd pinched from the prison kitchen and whatever half-frozen vegetables he could dig out of the hard alpine earth. He walked for 8 days. He crossed mountain passes that would challenge a professional climber in full gear, fueled by nothing but raw adrenaline and a pathological refusal to be a prisoner. His feet were shredded, his ribs were showing, and his beard was a tangled thicket of ice and dirt. But he never stopped. He was a ghost haunting the mountains, moving toward the sound of the big guns. Imagine you're a 19-year-old GI from Nebraska, driving your Jeep through the Italian countryside, thinking the war is almost over. Suddenly, a figure emerges from the tree line. He looks like a wild man. He looks like a prophet who has spent 40 years in the desert. But when he speaks, it's in the crisp, clipped tones of a British officer who is mildly annoyed by a late train. Captain Churchill, No. 3 Commando, requesting transport to the nearest British unit, and if you have a spare cigarette, I'd be much obliged. He didn't ask for a hospital bed. He didn't ask for a furlough. He asked for a way back to the fight. Jack was shipped to the Pacific. He had missed the end of the war in Europe, but the war with Japan was still raging. He was itching for one last charge, one last arrow, one last chance to lead his men into the teeth of the enemy. But then the world changed forever. The atomic bombs fell. Japan surrendered. The greatest conflict in human history was over. Most people wept with joy. They danced in the streets. They thanked God the killing was finally at an end. Jack Churchill? Jack Churchill looked at the newspaper, looked at his unused sword, and gave the most Jack Churchill response in recorded history. He wasn't joking. He was genuinely heartbroken. The greatest stage he had ever stood upon had just been dismantled, and Jack Churchill, the man who brought a sword to a machine gun fight, was a man out of time once again.
The last action hero. The war was over. The dictators were gone. The maps were redrawn, and the world was trying desperately to settle into the suburban comfort of the 1950s. Most veterans wanted nothing more than a quiet garden and a steady job, but Jack Churchill wasn't most veterans. For Jack, peace wasn't a rest, it was just a change of scenery. He stayed in the army, moving to the parachute regiment and later to Australia, where he became an instructor at the Land Air Warfare School. He didn't just teach soldiers how to fight, he taught them how to live with the volume turned up to 11. He became a pioneer of land surfing, a man who looked at the quiet boredom of the post-war era and decided to tackle it with the same intensity he'd used on the beaches of Norway. Eventually, Jack took a desk job with the Ministry of Defense. He became a commuter, a 9-to-5er. But even in the mundane world of British rail, Jack managed to spark a legend. Every day, at the exact same bend in the tracks, Jack would chuck his briefcase out the window. The other passengers thought he'd finally snapped. They thought the Mad Jack persona had finally devoured his mind. When he wasn't terrorizing train conductors, he was busy becoming the first person to ever surf the Severn Bore. Jack didn't buy a board, he built his own, a 14-foot plywood monster. He waited for the massive tidal wave to rush up the River Severn, and he rode that wall of water for over a mile, in a suit, because of course he did. He wasn't just surfing, he was reclaiming the joy of the wild in the heart of England. The truth? Pure, brilliant efficiency. The train tracks ran right past the bottom of his garden. Jack figured out that if he timed the toss perfectly, his bag would be waiting for him at the back door. Why carry a heavy briefcase home from the station like a common mortal when you can have it air-delivered to your own lawn? It wasn't madness, it was the ultimate life hack from a man who refused to waste a single second on drudgery.
Jack Churchill lived until 1996, reaching the age of 89. He died in his sleep, which, if we're being honest, is the only way death could have possibly caught him. But why did he do it? Why the bow? Why the sword? Why the bagpipes on a beach being raked by machine gun fire? Was he crazy? Maybe. But in an age of industrial slaughter, where men were turned into numbers and lives were ended by buttons pressed miles away, Jack Churchill chose to be a human being. He didn't want to be a cog in a machine. He wanted to be a character in an epic. His philosophy was simple: live life as a saga or don't live it at all. He brought a sword to a machine gun fight because a sword has soul. A bow requires a heartbeat. Bagpipes require breath. Mad Jack Churchill didn't just survive the most brutal war in human history, he conquered it. He turned the apocalypse into his personal playground and proved that even in an age of steel and atoms, a single man with a sword, a bagpipe, and a massive amount of audacity can become immortal. History is written by the victors, but legends are written by the ones who have the most fun winning.